Perfect. Welcome everyone to the Buying Your Own Home webinar. My name is Kimo and I have two great guys with me today. Ludo will be helping out with the presentation, the Q&A, and Cesar will be the expert on mortgage information and finances. Today is the goal to inform you, but before we get into the actual agenda, I'd like to introduce you to my team, to the team of Expat Housing Network. What we do is we help people find a home and feel at home, whether it's buying or renting. We can support you. We're very international. We have people from all over the place, so they know what it's like to move to a new country, set up a new life, and find a new home. If you decide to work with us in the future, you might encounter any one or multiple of my colleagues. Cesar?
Yeah, good evening, everybody. My name is Cesar.
I can't hear you, Cesar.
Oh. Can you? That's we are getting some chat messages that people can hear me.
I can hear you as well, Cesar.
I can hear you now as well. Sorry, it was my connection.
Thanks everybody for the text messages. My name is Cesar, founder of Mr. Mortgage. We're a mortgage brokerage and advisory firm. We're specialized in assisting internationals with their finances. When you call us, deal with us, then these are the people you will encounter. So yeah.
Perfect. Thanks for the intro. And like I said before, today's goal is to add value to you guys. We believe in sharing information freely and answering any questions that you have. What's the setup of this presentation? We'll first talk a little bit about a news flash, some news items for you to know. Then Cesar will share a little bit more about 3 reasons why you should buy versus rent a home or rent versus buy a home. He'll break down the advantages as well. Then we'll introduce you to the process of buying a home, help you understand the key players, and also the amount of money you would need to bring to the table to actually move forward. Then we'll answer any questions that you have. But what we always do is we have a number of frequently asked questions that we answer because we get them repetitively. So what I will ask you is please pop in your questions in the Q&A. And then what we'll do is we'll go over the frequently asked questions first, and then Ludo will sign off the questions that are related to that, and then any remaining questions we'll answer afterwards. So first the presentation, then the frequently asked questions, and then a Q&A. Please be mindful of the fact that this webinar is recorded, and that we'll share this with you as well, the presentation, so no need to write everything down. We've booked about 2 hours for this session. If we run over a little bit, that's fine, but we will have to cap it at some point. That's based on experience. We had a marathon a couple of times, so at the end there were only a handful of people left. So that's the setup of today. We're not going to talk too much about the market because we'll have a slide in the end which will actually challenge me and Serge a little bit to talk to you about the future of the market. But we're going to talk a little bit about the news flash. The first one being the NHG, the National Mortgage Guarantee. Some of you might be buying a property that is that you're buying for less than a certain amount. Last year, you were able to get this benefit if you bought a property for less than 310,000 euros, and this year you'll be able to buy a property for up to 325. There's a couple of things. Well, first of all, let me explain the NHG. The NHG is kind of like a guarantee that if something bad would happen to you, you would become unfit to work, or you would lose a partner or anything, and you wouldn't be able to actually pay the mortgage anymore, and you'd have to sell the house, and there would be a deficit, so you would lose some money on that. Then the mortgage guarantee will actually cover that amount. Good to know is that this guarantee is only applicable if you buy a property with a purchase price up to 325. So it's not about the valuation of the property, let's say you have a really good deal and you're buying a property for 325, but the valuation is actually 340, then the valuation has nothing to do with this. So it's the actual purchase price. There are some costs related to getting the national mortgage guarantees, but the benefits of this is the fact that you're guaranteed, plus that the interest rates of banks are much more interesting because there's less risk for them as well. So have a look at that if you're deciding to buy a property up to 325K. Then the transfer tax, Cesar can explain a little bit more about this. They made a really cool PDF, was it called a infographic, and they have a transfer tax checker. Maybe you want to share a little bit more about this.
Yeah, sure. So hot topic currently, property tax. When can you get an exemption from paying it? It's actually straightforward. If you're 34 or younger, and it's the first time you want to apply for the exemption when you buy a home, then you don't have to pay the property transfer tax. Maybe one step back, if you buy a home in the Netherlands, every time real estate changes ownership, the buyer is paying property transfer tax. There are a couple of scenarios. For example, if you're single, it's easy. If you're 34 or younger, then you don't have to pay it. But let's say you're in a couple, one of you is older than, or is 35 or older, and you are 33. Then in that case, you'll get the exemption on your part of the property. In other words, 50%. But your partner would not, because your partner is older than 34. So that's one exception. Another is, let's say one of you already had a property and you decide to buy one together. Then again, you look at how old you are. If you're both 34 or younger, and for one of you it's the second, then in that case, in the case that your partner didn't make use of that tax exemption before, then you don't have to pay it, so you pay 0%. I hope that clarifies. If not, you can use the transfer tax checker on our website and play around with scenarios.
As for mentioned, we'll share the presentation. There's a link behind this this button here, so please don't hesitate to check the transfer tax checker.
Yeah.
Renting versus buying.
Yep. So if you want to have a roof over your head, you have two options. One of them is renting and the other is buying. So you're comparing those two when it comes to the financial decision of renting versus buying. There are a couple of benefits to renting. You have flexibility. You usually have a contract or an agreement for a year, maybe 2 years. You don't have to deal with any taxes or maintenance, and you don't have to pay a down payment since you're not buying anything. Those are also more or less it's also more or less the downside of owning a home. So you have to pay taxes, you have to deal with maintenance, and it's harder to move because first you need to sell it and then you can move to elsewhere. So you have all these downsides. So you need to pay taxes, you need to deal with maintenance, it's harder to move. Are you still interested in buying then? Because buying has a couple of benefits, obviously. Buying means stability. You don't have to deal with a landlord that could decide not to prolong the contract, for example. Your monthly payments, since you're repaying your debt, you build equity. And since Dutch government wants people to own homes over here, you get a mortgage interest deduction. So the interest that you pay on your mortgage is tax deductible. downsides of renting. Rents could keep rising. There are no tax benefits, and you're not creating any wealth. So those were a couple of benefits or advantages and disadvantages of owning versus renting. You could also look at it from another perspective, and that's what you see in front of you is, so you have on the left side, you have a property on Gerard Douwstraat, 80 square meter in Amsterdam. The rent being asked is 2,250 euros per month, which makes 27K. So that's 27K down the drain. You will not see that back. On the right side, you see more or less same property, same neighborhood, slightly bigger. Asking price 525. And then you look at, okay, you are going to pay closing fees if you buy a home. Kimo will tell you later a bit more about that. In this case, you see closing fees 23K, 23,080. If you look at monthly payments of the mortgage, you're already paying less every month when you would buy this home, so 1,832. Within that payment, some of it goes towards repaying your debt. And what you can compare is paying rent is burning money. You will not see that back. And paying interest is burning money. And you will not see that back. And if you look at those two, then the interest payment per month is slightly less than 700. So the difference is actually bigger than when you look at the monthly payments. And then you look at closing fees. So initially you're paying 23K, but in this example, you're earning it back in 15 months. So this would be that if you live in this property for at least 50 months, then you would hit the break-even point. There's also equity. So same example, 525. You borrowed 100%. After 5 years, you decide to leave the Netherlands. Then what you look at is, because you've repaid your mortgage every month, the principal that needs to be repaid is 453. So you've almost repaid 72K or 71. So when you sell the property after 5 years for 525, so there has not been a change in this example in the selling price, then the cash at hand is 71K. So that's what you've saved up in 5 years.
That sounds like a no-brainer.
Mm-hmm.
But before you start, it's good to know that you would need to keep or have some capital at hand to actually complete the process of purchasing a home. So what will you need in savings? There's a couple of things that we are going to go over. You see 3 columns, one with the actual type of payment you need to make. The second one is the amount, and then the third one is whether the amount is tax deductible, which means that at the end of the year, when you file for taxes, you can deduct this amount of your taxable income. So depending on how much tax you'd pay, you'd get 40 to 46, or was it 38 to 46% back. Where we start is transfer tax. Cesar already mentioned this a little bit. If you're younger than 35, then you're exempt. If you're older than 35 years or older, then not. And then there's another criteria that if you purchase a property more expensive than 400,000 euros, then unfortunately you're not exempt. It doesn't really matter how old you are after the 1st of April. But let's say you have to pay transfer tax, then you'll pay 2% of the purchase price. This is also the highest closing fee or purchase cost or closing cost that you'll pay if you'd pay it. Unfortunately, it's not tax deductible. The notary technically does 2 things. They create the mortgage deed and the transfer deed. The mortgage deed costs range from 600 to 1,100 euros. You can find more expensive and more Well, sometimes you'll find cheaper notaries, but cheaper is not always better in this case. These costs are tax deductible for the mortgage deed, but the transfer deed, which technically makes you the owner of the property, is not tax deductible, and it's the same amount that you'd pay for that. Then you have bank fees or mortgage broker fees. Luckily, they're tax deductible, so that's quite nice. There's also no VAT that's charged on it, I believe, so that's good. Then you have the typical real estate agent fees, which is anywhere between 1 to 2%. It's not tax deductible. We put that at EHN, doesn't believe in percentages. Why would you pay more if you're already paying more? I think that's the wrong incentive for us to move forward. So we have fixed fees. Have a look at the website to see what these fees are. The appraiser charges 550 to 600 euros. If you have a bigger property, it might charge a little bit more. If you're planning on doing renovations, they also might charge a little bit more. So request that information. The technical inspector or the building inspector will charge about 425. I skipped, by the way, the appraiser is tax deductible. So technically what the government says that everything that is related to you getting your mortgage, because that's quite a complex product, is tax deductible. So the mortgage deeds, the mortgage broker, the appraiser, it's all linked to actually acquiring your mortgage. And that's why it's tax deductible. Then the interpreter, it's mandatory to have a interpreter or translator present at the day of transfer. Nowadays that happens remotely often, so they'll be on call and we'll translate everything for you. Then the bank guarantee, this depends on whether you pay in cash or not, but Cesar's going to talk a little bit more about that. There's cost involved. Some providers offer it for free, some not. And then you have the NHG amount, which is 0.7% of the amount that you're going to mortgage. And it is tax deductible. So now you know what you'd have to bring to the table. Take into account it's anywhere between 3 to 4% or 5 to 6%, depending on whether you pay transfer tax. So have that money in savings, because that is money you cannot allocate towards the actual bids that you have in mind. Then who will you meet? There's a few people that you'll meet. We already talked a little bit about them in the overview for your purchase fees. The notary is the first one. The notary is probably the most legal person that you'll find in this process. He'll kick into gear once your offer is accepted. There's two things though. There's a unwritten rule in Amsterdam that you'd have to use a notary for the purchase contract. Outside of Amsterdam, they don't draft the purchase contract. The selling agent does this. So double, triple check the purchase contract if you're buying outside of the Dutch capital. Doesn't matter where you are, the notary will take care of the mortgage deed and the transfer deed. He is an independent party, but he is paid by you. He will advise you to his best knowledge. He should also advise the selling party. The most important thing is that he makes sure that all the legal documents are correct and that you'll become an official owner of the property. Then you have the appraiser, Michelle. She will come into play when you have your offer accepted as well. Please don't ask anyone to appraise your property before your offer is accepted, because that would be a waste of your money if you don't get your offer accepted. Have her come in between you getting your offer accepted and you signing the purchase contract, because you want to know what the property is actually worth. Because that's going to be important for the bank. Cesar will tell you a little bit more about that as well a little bit later, but she'll draft and submit the application for the valuation to a independent institute called the NWWI. Once she gets confirmation from them that she played by the rules, then the bank will accept this valuation and say, okay, this is the amount of money that you can get. This takes between 3 to 7 days, so book her in as soon as possible. What she does, she goes to the property, takes a few photos, and then does the majority of the work at the office. I actually was present at a appraisal this morning, and he didn't spend more than 10 minutes in the property, and most of those 10 minutes were just chit-chatting to the sellers. The majority of the work, what they do is back in the office, they'll review a lot of information, look at properties sold in the last 6 to 12 months that are comparable, and then look at some of the other elements linked to the property. And based on that, they'll give a valuation. Then you have the building inspector, Millie. What she does is she comes also into play when your offer is accepted, because that's kind of like your period of due diligence between your offer acceptance and you signing the purchase contract. She'll inspect the property, make sure that when you buy a property that's a little bit older, I'm talking about older than 20, 30 years, to have somebody come in and inspect it. Newer properties, you might still want to have that done because sometimes they'll actually be able to see some bad construction, which you might miss. And these guys will be able to tell you if you need to fix the roof in the next 6 months, or you'd have a leakage or this or that. So I think it's super important because it's probably one of the biggest investments that you'll make. And you don't want to end up finding out that you'd have to spend another 10K on getting the property actually livable after you've moved in. So get this person in, they'll prepare the report within a day or two. And what you can do is, if you're not happy with the report, you might even consider negotiating a little bit more, depending on, of course, how popular the property is. Then you have Robin, the mortgage advisor. What he will do is a couple of things. And I think the most important thing is, I always like to compare a bank and a mortgage advisor. A bank is kind of like the retail shop. You go in there, unfortunately, they're closed nowadays, but not the banks, the retail shops, where you go in there and they have the products on sale that are there. So they'll try to sell you those as well. They will not tell you, by the way, like what you're looking for, you might actually find that next door, you might find that somewhere else. They will try to sell you their products. And that's very limited because most banks have 2, 3, 4 mortgage products. Whereas a mortgage advisor is kind of like your personal shopper, stylist. What they do is they want to make sure that you feel comfortable with the products that you've bought. You're aware of what you're buying, and it doesn't really matter where you buy it, as long as you're happy with it and you're fully aware of what you're getting yourself into. They have a range of 25, 30 products that they can actually offer you from different mortgage providers. Besides that, they know how to tell the story, because no matter what you think, the banks will react and respond to your case in general as a whole, but the story that's being told about you as a person with your financial securities and background is just as important as the documents that you provide. So this is important, what I believe, especially if you're from risk countries, but in general, I think it's good to have somebody on your side that can persuade and inform the bank about why they should actually accept your mortgage. You don't want to end up having an offer and then not getting a mortgage. And yeah, I believe that Mr. Mortgage is doing a great job with that. They've helped everyone. Honestly, this is from experience. We haven't had a case, and we've worked with some other providers as well. We haven't had a case where they weren't able to get a mortgage. So kudos to you guys. Then the buying consultant, that's us. What we will do is we will hold your hand during the process. There's 2 packages that we offer. One where we actually can hold your, touch elbows nowadays, where we actually join you to all the viewings and everything like that. The other one is a little bit more digital remote. We still do all the Zoom calls, but what the key of our work is managing your expectations, making sure that you know what the process is like, and that you don't, for example, overbid by too much, that you know what you're going for, that you know what kind of property you're bidding at, and what the value of that property is. Also, if there's any hidden secrets that you need to know about that property, we'll try and uncover them, because we'll review the documents that are linked to that property. I always say our added value is not so much in finding the right property. I think one of the big myths that real estate agents like to uphold is that they have properties that are off market. They'll be able to share that with you. I don't believe that. It's not true. Sometimes they get properties a day before they go on Funda, but then we have a Dutch saying that's a wax nose in the Netherlands. It's not really that much of an added value. What the real added value, I believe, is knowing the market, knowing the environment, and being able to do the research, right? So doing the price research, knowing what the market value is of the property, so you don't overbid or you don't underbid too much, and also knowing what the hidden secrets are about the property, and having that network of third-party vendors. So whether it's a notary, technical inspector, or in this case, a mortgage broker, we will be able to connect you to them and also review all the legal documents that you would be signing, so you know what you're signing up for, because that's as important as actually getting the property. Whew. Then you have the timeline. The timeline of the housing search and process looks a little bit like this. I'm not sure if you can see the cursor, but the first bit is a little bit skewed because this can take anywhere from a couple of weeks to a couple of months. Just today, we had an offer accepted. We actually had an intake 2 days ago with the client. That is exceptionally quick. On average, I would usually take the time and consider that this is not done in a month or a month and a half. Take your time because you want to find the right place, right? There's a big decision, it's a big loan that you'll be getting, so you don't want to rush into it. Of course, if you know what you want, it makes it a little bit easier. But let's say you found the place and in 2 weeks, it's again on a Wednesday, you'll submit an offer and your offer is accepted. Congratulations. But then your due diligence starts, right? So you have about a week to get everything in place, get the appraiser to come by, the technical inspector, and get their reports ready. And then you'll sign the purchase contract, which happens here. The purchase contract is the first and probably one of the most important legal documents because it's the agreement between you and the seller. And then once you've signed that, the seller is bound to the agreement. You still have 3 days to reconsider, have doubts, and pull out without giving any reason. That's the cool-off period. Your mortgage application will be complete or done once you've signed the purchase contract. Please be mindful is that the guys from Mr. Mortgage can already get a lot of the documentations to the banks. So don't wait until you've signed the purchase contract. Sit down with them before, preferably even before you start searching, because it's important to know what you can actually spend. So we always refer you to them to make sure that you know you can actually spend. And then they'll prepare you for the mortgage process. But let's say the final steps of the applications are done. After you sign the purchase contract, it takes about 1 to 4 weeks to get your mortgage approved. No pressure to the guys from Mr. Mortgage, but 4 weeks, not very often. It's more closer to 1 week. So that's a good sign. And then your mortgage is approved, which is great. And then sometimes a little bit of a waiting game starts because sometimes the seller only wants to move out the 1st of April. You'd have to wait a month or a month and a half or 2 months or 3 months, depending on how fast they want to move out until you become the owner. Now, what happens about 7 days before you become the owner, you get the final statement of completion. That's the final invoice. What we discussed were the closing fees, that list, plus the mortgage or plus the purchase price is something that needs to be paid. Well, deduct the mortgage from that amount, and then you'll have some outstanding costs that you need to transfer. These need to be in place before the transfer takes place. And on the day of transfer, you'll go to the property, do a final inspection, and then you'll sign at the notary. You'll become the proud owner of a house and of a mortgage. And then you have about 2 months to inform the selling party about anything that is damaged that should have been mentioned during or before the transfer. Please be mindful, the longer you wait, the more difficult it becomes to prove if something was not working when you actually moved in. So try and test everything out as soon as possible and make sure that you actually inform the seller. And to give an example, we had a power socket not working. That wouldn't have been that much of an issue if it wouldn't have been the circuit that was kind of like broken to some extent and would cost the buyer about 1,500 euros to actually fix it. We found out within a couple of days after move-in, which was good because we held the seller liable. But don't wait too long, because the longer you wait, the more difficult it becomes to prove. That's the timeline. Now, wow, we actually ran through that presentation. Sorry if I spoke a little bit too quickly, but I think the added value for you is in getting your questions answered as well. We'll start with 10 frequently asked questions that we get a lot of the times. And then we'll go over the Q&A. Please pop all your questions in the Q&A, even if they're follow-up questions. We'll try to answer the majority, if not all, within the time that we have. First question, Cesar, can I get a mortgage with a temporary contract or as a freelancer?
Short answer, yes, you can. To make it more elaborate, if you have a temporary contract or a definite contract, then it's so us convincing a bank that you'll get a fixed contract. Your employer also needs to, some people call it a letter of intention, but it's actually a simple form that they need to fill out and declare if they have the intention of giving you a fixed contract after your current contract ends. But it's also good to think about if you feel comfortable in that position, but that's something you need to decide for yourself. As a freelancer, it depends a bit on your track record. You need at least a track record of 12 months. So you can show the bank what you've earned in a year. So yeah, in both cases, you can get a mortgage approved.
Thank you. Maybe you'd like to ask me the question.
Yeah, sure. No, sorry.
No worries, no worries.
What happens, Kimo, if you want to leave the country after several years and you bought a home?
This is a question we get very often because the majority of you are from abroad, so who knows what's going to happen. Maybe you want to move back, maybe you're relocated by your employer, or maybe you're just sick of the Netherlands, which I can't really imagine. But there's three options. One is you can keep your home, but you still would continue to pay the mortgage, right? You're allowed to have a home in the Netherlands and not live in the Netherlands. Then the second option is you can rent out your home. You would need permission from the bank though. We'll talk a little bit more about that in one of the next few questions. Then the third option is you can actually sell your home, and then the lucky thing about the Netherlands is that we don't charge capital gains tax, and there's no penalty from your mortgage provider if you sell your home and you pay off your mortgage. So these are the three options. Renting out your home is probably something that you might want to consider. Cesar will share a little bit more about that in a few, but these are the three options, definitely possible, but have a think about what is it you'd like to do. How long are you leaving the country for? Is it indefinite? Is it for a few years? Because that's going to have an impact on which decision you can make. Cesar, how much can I borrow from the bank?
Yeah, so you can borrow up to 100% of the value of the property, or you can borrow 100% based on your income. Whichever is the lowest is what you can borrow.
Okay. Can you give an example for an income of 100%?
Yeah, sure. So let's say, so you already spoke about the appraiser Michelle in your example. So you bought a home for, let's say, 400K. Michelle goes to the property. She sets up a valuation report, and in the valuation report, it says that the value of the property is 410K. Based on your income, you can borrow 600K. In this case, so based on income, you can borrow 600K. Based on the value of the property, you can borrow 410K, even though you bought it for 400K. Other way around, let's say the value and the purchase price is the same, 400K, but based on your income, you can borrow 350K. Then the bank will only give you 350K, and the rest needs to come from your savings.
Thanks.
Kimo, this one is for you. And this is an interesting question. Where to buy a home?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I would like to make this one a little bit interactive because we might have people from all over the country in this webinar. So I'm going to first return the question to everyone in the webinar and maybe pop it in the chat because the question to you will be, where would you like to buy a home? In what city or area would you like to buy a home? And then I can address some of these, because if there's like 40 different cities, then look, there they go. Mm-hmm. That's a big range.
Yeah,
I love a good challenge. Okay, that is good to know, because instead of going micro, I'm going to go macro a little bit on this one. There's a couple of things that you want to look into when you consider buying a home somewhere. The first and the foremost and the most important thing is, where do you feel comfortable? And I think that has to do with the way of your life, what kind of property you would want, and your budget as well. So let's say you're a family, then you might have other preferences than if you're a single or a couple, right? So have a look at those criteria first, like what kind of property would you feel comfortable in, and also what kind of neighborhood would you feel comfortable in, right? Do you want to have a lot of facilities nearby, or do you want to have public transport nearby and don't want to be in the busy areas of the city? Because that's key to where I think the quality of life, right? You want to end up in a place where you feel comfortable. If you walk outside, you feel like this is home. If you walk inside, the same thing, but also have a think about what you would like to do with the actual property. One of the mistakes I made is that I moved to a new home while my partner was pregnant. And if I would have known how nice a garden would have been, I would have went for a place with a garden. But we were still in that mindset of cosmopolitan, loving the city vibe, going out and stuff like that. So we went for the neighborhood. In the end, I'm still super happy with the place, but especially in summers and even a little bit in winters, the garden would have been nice. So do a little bit of life planning as well, right? Like, what do you see yourself doing a year? What do you see yourself doing now? And especially now with COVID, I think it's super important to be aware of what your life looks like and what you would need. That's more from internal perspective, right? So what do you need to be happy? The second thing is more external, right? Because you want to buy something that is value sustainable or that might increase a little bit in value. If you go to the popular areas, so if I take Amsterdam as an example, there are certain neighborhoods that are very popular and the price per square meter is relatively high. You might think, okay, hey, that's going to increase in popularity, but there's no guarantee that it will increase in popularity, especially with COVID. People might change their behavior a little bit and say, okay, I'm going to maybe move to a place where there's a little bit more space. I think there's a couple of elements that add value to a neighborhood that might not be as popular yet. And I think the first thing is it connected? Is there a nature nearby? And what is the price per square meter and the demographics of that neighborhood as well? Because I think those things have an impact on the properties, on the quality of life, and also have a look at the facilities. We sometimes in jest say where the creatives go, that's where the rest of the people will go as well, eventually. And if I look at Amsterdam, but also if I look at Eindhoven and some of the other cities, we see that the places where creatives have kind of like gathered and concentrated in 5 to 10 years, that's where the project developers will also go, because most likely it's because it's still relatively affordable. So have a look at that as well. If I would say, and I'm going to again, because the majority of you said Amsterdam, if I would base it on Amsterdam, I would say the north of Amsterdam. Why? Because it's close to a natural nature element, which is the river splitting the north and the south of the eye. It's relatively underdeveloped yet. There's still a lot of industry that's going to be developed in the next 3 to 5 to 10 years. And there's this psychological barrier for people because there's a river in between. But honestly, if you go to London, Sydney, or any of these cities, then that river is mere I don't know, it's actually an attraction at some point, right? People will like to live near water because they can walk past it and so on, so on. So have a look at that as well in some of the other cities. In Eindhoven, I would say that the near the campus in the south is very attractive, but also for Utrecht and The Hague and Rotterdam, look at some of these qualities. Where's a lot of industry and where's the price per square meter still relatively low compared to some of the more popular areas, but the neighborhood feels comfortable. There's a lot of facilities, because sometimes it might just be that it's a little bit further from the center, but it still has that value. But people, because they would like to live in the center, have not seen it yet. And if I know one thing, that cities expand, right? So first the center is super important, then it expands a little bit, expands a little bit, expands a little bit. So at some point, a neighborhood that might not be very popular yet will become center of that attractiveness. So have a look at that. Poof, that's a lot. If you want to go into specifics, reach out to me or reach out to us, and we're happy to share more information about the specific cities and what areas we'd like to. We think you should buy a home. But again, it starts with what do you feel comfortable with. Hope that answered the question a little bit. Cesar, can I rent out my house or a room?
Renting out a room is possible. So getting a roommate so you can split the bill, that's fine. You need to inform your bank that you have a roommate, and your roommate needs to sign a letter where they confirm that if there's a foreclosure on your home because you didn't pay the mortgage, then your roommate cannot make use of any tenancy rights. so they can be kicked out of the home by the bank. Renting out your home or your apartment is not that easy. Why is that? Renting out your home means you're not living there anymore, as opposed to renting out a room. You'd still be living there. As a tenant, or let me rephrase. So what a bank says then is, we have an extra risk, and that risk is that the value of the property is changing, since it's not a residential property anymore, but an investment. Since you're trying to get a return on the investment that you made. So you need our approval. In this case, what you look for is buy-to-let mortgages. Those mortgages have different terms. Those mortgages have different conditions. Interest rates are a bit higher. But yeah, so you can rent out your home, but not with a traditional residential mortgage. You would need to get a separate, or you need to get another financial product for that.
Perfect. Thank you.
Kimo, this is also an interesting question. So when I go to Funda, because I'm a Fundaholic, I spend all my free time on Funda. I look at these prices and I think, okay, so if I see a property for 500K, I'll just add 10% on top of it, and then I'll probably get and win the bid. Or how does that work? What's the typical amount I should overbid?
That's a good question. And my first answer is that there's no clear answer to that in terms of what you're expecting. So there's no amount, there's no percentage that we would advise you to overbid. Why? Is because the price that you see on Funda is the price that is offered or that is requested by the selling party. But what they normally do is they say, okay, hey, we get somebody in to value our property, and let's say the property is valued at 540. Then if they would put it up for 540, then if somebody would overbid by 10%, they might not get a mortgage for that amount, because the bank is going to say, no, it's only worth 540, and you have to put up 50K yourself. The other thing is that the selling agent will want to have as many people in as possible, because, well, he wants to show off a little bit towards the seller, and he also wants to have multiple offers, right? So what he's going to do, he's going to lower the price. He's going to put it up for 499 or 500. Most of the time, it's very easy because you have these price brackets within Funda, and they take into account that, hey, if they would put it up for 501 euro, 1,000 euro, then a lot of people wouldn't see it because they wouldn't cap it at 500,000, the search. So that's important for you to know. So the value that you see on Funda is not the actual market value. And what we do is we do the research and say, okay, hey, what is the actual market value of the property? Because based on that, you can submit your offer. You can say, okay, this is the market value. This is what we think we'll get from the bank. If I have some cash myself, then I'm willing to put that up because it's a very beautiful property. It's very competitive. And we think that you need a little bit more to make it attractive for the seller, or I'm fed up with this whole process. I've submitted 5 offers and now I want this place. So what we do is we say, okay, hey, it's actually worth 540. What you want to submit is up to you, right? We believe it's competitive, so I would submit a little bit more. Or if it's not really competitive and the seller wants to sell quickly and you have everything they need to actually transfer quickly, then you could consider negotiating a little bit. We actually were able to negotiate 50K of, it was a little bit more expensive. I have to give a little bit of context of the property that we got accepted today. But hey, it's still possible. It doesn't happen very often that you can actually get it for below, because like I said, they most of the time put it up for lower than the actual market value. But every now and then, if a seller is desperate or it's been sold, but the financing hasn't come through from the previous buyer, then they might be willing to negotiate a little bit, right? But don't stare yourself blind on the property price and say, oh, but I've heard that you have to offer 10% over, because once you take that as a measurement, then it's very difficult to get your offer accepted, because some properties you need to overbid by more or less, or you actually can underbid a little bit. So don't stare yourself blind and base your offer on the market value, not on the asking value. Cesar, so I've got a property, I've got the mortgage accepted. What happens if I leave my job or lose my job? I don't want to get stuck with a mortgage and having to pay something. So what's the process there?
So once the mortgage is approved and you've been to the notary, signed all the paperwork, got the keys, then it doesn't matter if you change your jobs. Losing a job is a different scenario. A bank wouldn't know, obviously. However, if you cannot pay the mortgage anymore because you lost your job and cannot find a new job, then the bank would like to know. But no, I'll share a personal story. So we also chose the neighborhood when we bought our first apartment, and coincidentally, it was in the same street as where Kimo lived. Or I think I moved there before you did, but when we bought it, I was working for one of the big banks, and then at some point I decided to move on and start Mr. Mortgage. And yeah, I had my mortgage. I was paying for it, and that was it. Yeah. So nothing happens. Yeah.
What happens if you get a new job and you earn less than what you initially used for your mortgage?
That is not a good position to be in, because yeah, you signed for your debt, and you need to pay the bank, and the bank is in 9 out of 10 cases the winner if you ever play Monopoly.
Okay, but if you can still pay the so let's say instead of earning 80K, you earn 70K, but it's still enough. The bank wouldn't do anything with that.
No, they wouldn't know. It's not as if the credit is revised or anything. It's
okay. Yeah. Okay, cool. Then, so we talked a little bit about the bank guarantee or something. I've heard that when you buy property, you need to make a down payment of 10% or down 10% deposit. Can you maybe share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So could you go back to the timeline, Kimo?
Yeah.
So we have the timeline over here. So the deadline to get the mortgage approved is 4 weeks. In this scenario, during those 4 weeks, the seller has zero security. Why is that? The seller doesn't know, and it's also none of their business, if you have a job, if you have savings. So they don't know anything about your financial position. Knowing this, they don't have any security because they don't know if the mortgage can get approved. And during those 4 weeks, they cannot sell the property to someone else. So they need to wait. And that's a lot of insecurity. When I sold my first home, I couldn't wait until I heard the good news that the mortgage was approved, that the buyer's mortgage was approved. So that's, in this example, 4 weeks. At some point as a seller, you'd like to have security as well. Usually that's 1 week after the approval or the deadline of the mortgage approval. So that's in the 5th week in this example. So in that 5th week, you can do 2 things to give the seller security. And this is a common practice over here. So you can either transfer 10% of the purchase price to the notary as a deposit. So if you buy a home for 500K, you transfer 50K to the notary, to the notary's account. Or if you don't have that or don't want to do that, you can get a bank guarantee. And the bank guarantee is simply a letter from the bank stating, if our client is backing out of the deal, then we will pay the seller 10%. Obviously, the consequence is that you would have a debt to the bank, because again, the bank is always the winner. However, that's what the bank guarantee or the 10% deposit is for. So to give the seller security.
Perfect.
I hope that answered that question.
And a question for us both.
Mm-hmm.
Cesar, what impact do you think COVID-19 has or will have on the housing market?
Mm-hmm. Shall I focus on the banks and mortgages? So you can elaborate more on how the housing market, housing prices. So what happened last year? So the lockdown started on the 16th of March, or was it 19th? In March. And what we saw during the first two to 3 weeks was that banks were increasing their mortgage rates by 0.2, 0.3. And actually, for almost 2 to 3 months, because nobody knew at first what was going to happen, but for 2 to 3 months, even though the European Central Bank started protecting the economy with stimulus, as did the governments in the EU. Even though that was going on, banks kept their interest rates slightly higher than they had than what they had before. And what we saw, it started in August, September. Slowly, step by step, interest rates went down 0.01, 0.02. And currently, we're at exactly the same spot as we were 1 year ago before the pandemic started. So that's what happened with banks and their mortgage rates. Because of all the stimulus, I don't see this changing anytime soon, because it will put a lot of pressure on people, on consumers, on companies, on governments. Currently, money is cheap. If that changes during a pandemic, I don't believe that is I don't believe that that would be the right strategy for the central bank, and I have a lot of trust in them. So, yeah. But what about the housing market from the real estate, from a real estate perspective, Kimon?
So I wish I would have like central banks printing money for the real estate forecast. I think that there's a couple of things. It's very easy to make a comparison with the 2008 crisis and say, oh, we're in another crisis every 8 to 10 years. That's bound to happen, but it's delayed already a little bit. So it's very easy to say that the market's going to go down. But I want to share that the difference between the Dutch housing market now and the Dutch housing market back then is relatively big. And one of the major things is that the loan to value. So back then you could get a mortgage of up to 116%, if I'm correct, of the value of the property. And you would just spend the rest of the money on, I don't know what. And then you'd have a debt, right? Okay, let's say you would go for that amount. And then, well, your prices would drop, or the value of the property would drop. Then a lot of people have a problem with paying back their mortgage or selling their homes. And that's when a crisis can happen. Now, because the Dutch government has said, okay, hey, you can only borrow up to 100% of the value of the property. And technically they lowered that amount year by year. So it wasn't 100% starting 2008, but they lowered it gradually. And now the majority of the people have actually, well, they had some savings because they needed to buy those, pay off the purchase costs. And they don't have a mortgage of more than 100% of the value of the property. Okay, that protects the market to some extent, right? Because if the market dips a little bit, and a lot of properties have increased in value over the last years, so they can take a little bit of a hit. So let's say the market dips a little bit, and that's fine, and it's not going to go crazy. I also don't see necessarily a domino effect on the housing market level, which will cause institutional crisis. But that's the first thing. That's the difference between 2008 and now. The other thing is that money is cheap. So the interest rates from before 2018 would go up to like 5-6%. And now interest rates are 1.7, 1.9. So interest is relatively low. So it's very attractive for people to buy a home versus renting a home, especially in the major cities where rents have increased. And if I know one thing is that the Dutch housing stock doesn't expand as fast as it should, because there's still a housing shortage of about 300,000 properties in the Netherlands, which means that there's more people still looking for the property that they want, and there's properties on offer, and especially in some of the urban areas, we see this happen. Of course, it differs per region, right? So you have the more rural places, which might have an effect, or what we've seen in the last year, we've seen that turn around actually, where the biggest increase in prices went to the rural areas because people suddenly decided they wanted to have a place with space. They wanted to have a garden. They wanted to have that extra room because, hey, they were working from home. So if I look into the future, I see a couple of things. I see, first of all, COVID not going away anytime soon. I love the vaccine. I'm super happy that it's there, but we'll be dealing with this for the next few years, right? And maybe not in the size that we've been dealing with it the last 12 months, but it's going to be there, and maybe will evolve a little bit, and it will end up becoming a milder version of what it was, but we'll still deal with that. So based on the behavior of some of the governments, especially the Dutch government, I foresee that working from home is still going to be attractive this year. And in the next few years, I believe that if it has managed to become a proper behavior and a custom, then we'll see people moving to places where they have a little bit more space. However, cities will remain attractive. Why? Because they're the beating heart of the economy, right? There's a lot of young people moving towards city. Why? Because there's a lot to do. They want to be surrounded by other young people. They want to be surrounded by facilities, amenities, things that they can do, culture, name it, name it, name it. You won't see that a lot in the more rural areas, right? We will see that concentrated in the cities. Why? Because the infrastructure is there. And well, if I've seen anything, the price in Amsterdam have still increased compared to last year. And I don't necessarily foresee that changing anytime soon. Maybe at some point there will be a little bit of a plateau, but I don't see the prices dipping anytime soon in the next 6 to 12 months. Of course, I don't have a glass ball. If I would have had a glass ball, I would probably be sitting on the beach and sharing my information online with you instead of on the webinar. But okay, so those were the two things I wanted to mention in terms of looking into the future, how COVID will impact it and what's going to happen to the cities. So will it have a negative impact? Not yet, but don't forget that it's still promoted, or it's still sustained by the stimulus that Cesar was talking about as well, right? Money is cheap. There's a lot of money being put into the market. What effect that has is very, very difficult to say, because at some point they have to build down and stop the stimulus, all right? And so far, the Netherlands have done a good job in terms of managing the impact on the economy from COVID. But who knows what will happen when they close the tap and say, okay, hey, now you have to do it on your own. That's very difficult. And I'm also not an economist, so I won't be able to say what it means if the market is flooded by that much money. Like if there's one apple and the whole city wants to buy that apple, it's a very expensive apple. But if suddenly a farmer comes in and he brings up 10,000 apples, then what does that do to the value of that apple? It's very difficult to say. So I'm talking about the value of money. I'm not going to go into details with that. So that's a very complex matter. So I can't look beyond the next 6 to 12 months because that's just too complex for my brain to handle. But for the next foreseeable future, I don't see anything happen. Plus, what I want to say is don't buy a house and sell it again after a year, right? You don't want to speculate with a property. So even if we would see a little bit of a dip, I don't foresee it to be as big as 2008. It might be a couple percentages, or it might plateau a little bit. But after that, it's definitely going to go back up again. People will get more kids. Like this is a habit that they can't shake. And people will want to move to places where they can find a better life. And so far, the Western world has done a good job. From a geopolitical perspective, it depends on how some of these other countries are doing. If, for example, well, no, I'm not going to go into politics or religion. Let me stay clear from that. But some of the countries that are going through some turmoil might create kind of like an excess of talent there to countries that are a little bit more peaceful and quiet. And if there's one thing, then the Netherlands is relatively stable when it comes to that. We have a very good political system, which sometimes is very difficult to get into action. But on average, there's no anomalies or crazy occurrences here. So I think that's going to be attractive as well, besides healthcare, besides multicultural cities and so on. So I think the Netherlands overall is still going to be a really cool place to live. The only thing it doesn't have is a lot of sunshine. But hey, wait a couple of months and you'll find out about that. So I think that you'd still be able to get a good investment here in the Netherlands. Oof. Then that covers the questions that we had. Pop your questions in the Q&A. Ludo will be asking them and we'll be giving them to Cesar or me. And I will try to answer most, if not all of them. Ludo, take it away.
Cool. So before I start with the Q&A, I'm gonna pop a message in the chat so that you guys can, if there, of course, is if you guys would like to do that, book in a few minutes with us, either this week or next week, to have a personal chat and answer some personal questions. I'm going to start off with the Q&A. I see that we also have a few questions in the chat, so that I will go over them afterwards. Let's see. The first question is from Yusri. The question is the NHG cap limited what you pay for the mortgage, excluding your own money that you put in? I think that's for you, Cesar.
Yeah. No, the purchase price of the property is leading. So you can, in other words, if you buy a property for 1 million, and you put in 675K just to lower the mortgage to 325, then you cannot get NHG. But then again, it also doesn't make sense because NHG is for first-time home buyers who don't have a lot of savings, and it's to protect them if they lose their job. Usually first-time home buyers are younger, so the government wants to protect them if they got disabled or lose their job, and if you buy a property for 1 million, as in my example, it doesn't make a lot of sense to get NHG.
Cool. All right. Next question could be answered by both of you. The question is from an anonymous attendee. What would be your advice on buying a second property in the Netherlands?
I'll give my thoughts, and then maybe Serge, you could share a little more about that. The first thing that comes to mind is the transfer tax. If you buy a second property you're not going to live in, then the transfer tax this year will be 8%. So you're going to pay a little bit more in closing fees to actually get a second property. Then the question is what you want to do with it. Do you want to just use it as a pied-à-terre, or do you want to rent it out? And this is technically my cue for the cue for Cesar. If you want to rent it out, then there were some consequences that I think maybe touched upon already, but maybe just high level repeated.
Yeah, sure. In the chat, I also saw another question. So I mentioned, so if you're getting a buy-to-let mortgage, then that's a different type of product with different terms and conditions, as I mentioned. And one of those terms and conditions is usually you can borrow around 2/3 from the bank, so 1/3 needs to come from you, from your savings. So I hope that answers that question. Second property, I hope you didn't mean when you're moving homes, so moving from, let's say, a smaller apartment to a bigger apartment, because that's a totally different story. You can do that. There are no restrictions. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Makes sense. The next question, I think it's for you, Kimo, is from Hale. Is there any energy label criteria for transfer tax? That house should be A label only, for example?
No, there's no link to the energy label in terms of transfer tax. There are some benefits of having a good energy label, though. Well, besides the property being energy sufficient, again, a little pass to Cesar. There might be some benefits for in terms of the mortgage.
So some banks offer discounts if you have a home that is that has a good energy label. Why is that? And the property has more value and is more sustainable for the future. So it's expected that with the way it's built, that the property is going to keep its value better than a property with a energy label F, let's say.
Yeah. And having said that, the last couple of years, the municipalities, but also the Dutch government has been promoting increasing and improving energy ratings. So having a energy label A will, like Cesar mentioned, increase the value of your property, but also will make it a little bit more sustainable in terms of the value, because in the next 5 to 10 years, it's going to be more important. So if you keep on holding onto your property, then having that energy label A, which is valid for 10 years from the day it's actually rated. So that's a good investment.
Okay. Next question, again from an anonymous attendee. Does transfer tax exemption under 35 apply if you own a home abroad?
Yeah, simple question. Oh, sorry. Go for it, Cesar.
So the term being a first-time home buyer is not you owning a home abroad or not, or anything like that. It's more about, have you ever used the exemption before? That answer is no, because then you would have bought a home between now and the 1st of January. So yeah, even if you own 10 homes abroad, then over here, if you buy a residential home, you can still make use of that tax exemption.
Cool, great. Next question is from Tarek. Is the interpreter going to write an English contract that you will sign, or does he read it for you and you have to sign a Dutch one?
A process question. So so during the transfer, the notary will read out the Dutch transfer deed and mortgage deed, and the interpreter will translate it on the spot. So he'll verbally translate everything, and you'll sign the Dutch version. Banks will require that. There won't, like for the purchase contract, there will be or sometimes there's an English translation, but for the transfer deed and the mortgage deed, it's a Dutch contract that's translated on the spot by the interpreter.
A small addition to that, the notary is obliged by law to read those deeds in Dutch. And so those deeds have to be in Dutch. And why you need an interpreter is the notary needs to make sure that the person signing the deed has understood what they're signing for. So that's maybe a bit of background story.
Yeah. All right, then another question regarding the notary from Pradeep. Does notary differs any aspects in terms of working? As you mentioned, cheaper notary is not always better. So
yeah, so there's a couple of things. Well, notaries are humans as well, so they sometimes make mistakes, but also having a good level of knowledge and being able to communicate in English is very important. Some notaries offer a very shallow translation, and their communication in English is not that good. I would not necessarily say that the more expensive the notary is, the better he is. But I wouldn't say like the more cheaper, the worse he is. But there is a level of quality that we like to work with, which means that the notary takes his time for you as a client. They communicate in the language that you would understand. Of course, you can't expect them to speak Chinese or Russian, but English. And that their documents are in order and that their timelines are in order as well. Because you want to make sure that you receive everything in due time and not one day before you become owner. So those criteria matter. Can you tell that off the price? No, not necessarily. So having somebody or having a referral or something like that, or double checking with the notaries themselves can sometimes be beneficial. But I do know is that in some of the bigger cities, the notaries charge more than in smaller cities or in the rural areas. So that's where also the price difference can come from. So yeah, hope to answer your question a little bit.
Cool. So once you've secured your home, this is a question from Masil. What are the taxes that you have to pay? And are these yearly or monthly?
These are called municipality taxes. You have a few of them. One of them is sewage, waste, garbage tax, water board taxes. They're yearly. You'll probably pay them around in March. And you have something called property tax as well. I think it's 0.03 something percent that you'll pay on an annual basis as well. And it's technically based off the WOZ value, which is the value that the municipality gives to your property. It's not actually the market value or the price that you paid for the property. So we're trying to keep that as low as possible. And those are the taxes that you pay. Of course, you'll have service fees for the owner association, utility bills, stuff like that. But that's as far as the taxes go. Maybe Cesar, what about wealth tax, if there's anything that applies?
Yeah, there's one more, but you will not get an invoice. There's also a homeowner's tax that you're paying annually. The homeowner's tax is usually being paid for by your tax benefit, and therefore you're not feeling it because you're not transferring money to the tax authorities. But it is a tax you're paying. But you're paying it with the tax benefit that you receive. So yeah, there's no invoice and there's no transfer of money, but you are paying it. Yeah.
Okay. Then another question for you, Cesar, from Panindra. What is the catch, if there is a catch, in 100% funding on value of property?
Okay, so you have this question can be answered in two ways. There's no catch. If you work with a bank or a broker, it doesn't matter. For a broker has charges a fixed fee. It doesn't matter if you borrow, let's say 5K or 5 million. That fee is fixed and stays the same. So from the broker's perspective, there's no catch. Then you look at two things. You have the financial side of it, keeping your savings. Kim already mentioned paying 1.7% per year or 1.6% per year on interest. It means that, let's say, you don't put in 50K as a down payment. You borrow 100%, you use that 50K to invest it elsewhere. Most likely, over the long term, you'll get a better return than the 1.6 you don't need to pay anymore on your mortgage. So that's the financial side of things. You also have financially, it doesn't make a lot of sense to pay down. However, you also have the emotional side. If you want to have a lower debt and you sleep better because you have a lower debt, then you should 100% pay down on the mortgage or even not borrow 100% from the start. But we will guide you through that in making that decision.
All right, then the next question is again from the anonymous attendee. This question is, how much can I borrow based on my income, and how is this calculated? He says, for instance, valuation and income-based amount is 390K, but purchasing amount is 400K. Now I don't have 10K savings. What will happen? Can I cancel the contract?
Yeah. It depends. So Kimo will guide you through signing the purchase agreement. And in the purchase agreement, when you sign it, you're not only negotiating about the price, but you're also discussing other terms and conditions. One of those terms and conditions is some call it a mortgage clause, some call it a financial clause. It's simply the deal being subject to getting a mortgage approved. And then you can have this in as a clause, but you can also set up this clause with details. So to give you an example, if I cannot get a mortgage approved for, I'll use the same numbers, 400K, then you can cancel the agreement. So in a scenario where you can only get a mortgage approved up to 390 because that was the value of the property, you can cancel the agreement. However, there are fees involved and you would lose a lot of time. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to do it that way, but you can cancel the agreement in that scenario. I hope everybody still follows.
That was clear.
All right, well, I'll just move on to the next question then. Next question is from Zach. Zach asks, can I search and bid for properties before approaching any mortgage providers, or should I have a mortgage pre-agreed with a bank?
Timo?
Can I answer that? Yes. So of course you can search and bid on a property before you've talked to a mortgage provider or mortgage broker. We would, however, not recommend that. Why? Because let's say your offer gets accepted, then you don't have that much time to do all your due diligence, right? To get the mortgage broker or bank aligned, and to make sure that you have everything in place to finalize the application after you sign the purchase contract. The other thing is that you want to know what you can actually borrow, right? You also want to know what kind of interest you're going to pay. So I think it's super important to have a chat with someone before you submit an offer, because you also want to figure out what the chances are of you actually getting your mortgage application go through. Let's say you submit an offer. Sorry. Let's say you submit an offer and you're signing the purchase contract. It turns out that what you've offered, or you have a bit of a difficult case and you don't get your mortgage approved. If you forgot to put in a mortgage clause in the offer, then you're committed. So don't take that risk. Do your due diligence, right? If you want to speed up the process, that's fine, but have a chat with a mortgage broker because they'll be able to tell you what you can expect, what you can borrow. And from there on, you have some freedom. But again, if you want to make an attractive offer, then part of that offer is how fast can you get your things arranged? How serious are you about the process? If the selling agent feels you're not very serious because you haven't done your math, or you're overbidding by a crazy amount, or the timeline that you've submitted is too long, then they might not take your offer seriously, and then you lose out on the bid. So do your homework. This is a big thing, big decision. You don't want to rush into it and find out that you've wasted your own time, somebody else's time, or that you're stuck in a deal that you can't get out of and you have to pay a 10% fine.
Okay, all right. Then I have another question for you, Kimo. It's from Christina, and she says, what are the projections for the housing prices now that the government announced they are building more? Is there a difference, or is this different for the major cities like Amsterdam?
I love that question. It's rhetoric, so or rhetoric. The government always says they're going to build more, and if there's one thing that they can't, and we've had some issues in the last year or 2 years with environmental regulations, which put kind of like a little bit of a brake on construction. So yes, they're saying it, but they never meet the quota. So it's very difficult to say that they're going to honor their word. And honestly, believe me, like in 3 months, there's elections. It's going to change on a municipality basis. Who knows what the economy will bring? So I wouldn't necessarily count on this. They've been very consistent in not meeting the quota. So if they were to change it, something else would need to happen. And the system is not prepared for a sudden change or influx of new properties built, because it takes a while to get your permit through. It takes a while to build a property. So even if they have the intention to build more, you'll only learn in the next 3 to 5 years. And yeah, that's too far away, but I wouldn't necessarily count on it. Sorry. Or on the other hand, might be a good thing for you guys.
Exactly. All right, cool. Back to you, Cesar. We have a question from Mark. His question is, the example used as an interest rate of 1.58%, which makes buying quite attractive. What happens if the rates go back up? Are you protected from that? Are the rates usually fixed or for a period?
Good question. So that rate that you saw in the example is a fixed rate for 10 years. So the rate is will not change during the first 10 years. What happens after is a big question mark. I could tell in 9.5 years from now what's going to happen more or less in 10 years. So yeah, but so the rate is fixed for 10 years in this example. But you can choose anything between a variable rate that changes on a monthly base, up until fixing it for 30 years. So the rate never changes, but the more security you buy, so the longer you fix the interest rate, the more you pay.
Cool. Then again for you, Cesar, Alex, question from Alex. He has a fine in his home country of around 6K. He does not intend to pay this. It's not regulated yet. Will this cause a problem in getting a mortgage?
Thank you for your honesty. So I'll approach this in a bit of a different way. So when clients come to us, we have the duty to take care of their finances. In this example, it means making sure that you do not get a credit that you cannot pay back later. Because not paying back a loan has consequences. So getting back to the topic, if you have a debt of 6K, my advice would be to either make sure to pay that back, or we calculate how much you can borrow and deduct that 6K from the calculation.
Okay. All right. I'm going to stay with you again, Cesar. Question from Bella. Does the marital status play a role in determining the mortgage amount?
No. So no, marital status doesn't have any effect on the amount you can borrow. It does have an impact on when you buy a home. You suddenly have an asset that you own. So if you buy it with a boyfriend, girlfriend, then you own it for 50%, both of you. If, and this is a horror scenario, if your boyfriend or girlfriend would pass away, then your boyfriend's or girlfriend's heirs, or the asset for 50% will be in their heritage. And then it's a question of who is receiving that heritage. Owning 50% means you can vote on what happens with that asset. It also means that that 50% can decide to sell the property because they don't want to be liable for the mortgage payments. So suddenly you're without a boyfriend, girlfriend, without a home. Yeah, it's not an ideal scenario. There are ways to solve this, but that's something we can discuss during a different discussion.
Exactly. Let's hope that doesn't happen indeed. So for the ability to get a mortgage, does it affect anything at all if you're over 40, for example, or if you have any children or people who are dependent on you?
No, no. So uh, 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 I once helped someone when I was still working at a bank as a junior. There was a lady. She was 94, and she got a mortgage for 30 years. And this is 8 years from today. I hope she still lives in her home. But yeah, so age doesn't matter. Income matters. Income is the foundation for a mortgage. If you have income, you can get a mortgage. Yeah.
Okay. Kimo, you were talking about the timeline and the process of securing a home. Is this process any different from, for example, getting a plot to build a house?
Getting a plot is a little bit different because, well, you can go and view the plot, but most of the time plots are sold through municipalities, and there's a different approach to it. You'd have to register and sign up for the plot, and depending on how popular it is, it's going to be awarded to people. If you buy a plot from a private owner, then the setup is somewhat similar. But forget, you don't value a property on the plot, so you value the plot itself. From a mortgage perspective, we haven't done a deal like this before. Cesar, I'm not sure if there's any intricacies to the mortgage approach when you buy a plot of land.
Yeah. So then, if you want to get a mortgage, you're getting a mortgage based on plans, based on a plan. So this, and if it's based on a plan, then there's a lot of insecurity for a bank. A bank doesn't like that, so it could have implications on how much you can borrow, or if the bank will approve the mortgage application. So yeah, it could have implications, but it depends on the case.
Yeah. One thing that I might want to add is that, especially if you buy plants from the bigger cities, there might be ground lease. So you're technically not buying the plot, but you're buying the right of usage to the plot. But the municipality still owns it, and they kind of like rent it out to you on a yearly basis. I've seen ground leases go up to 5,000-6,000 euros per year in Amsterdam. It is tax deductible, some of it, but still take into account that might have an impact on the amount that you can actually borrow. Like Cesar mentioned, it's based on plans, and I think that especially if you buy from the municipality, they'll want to be involved in the process, and sometimes there's a time frame within which you have to actually finalize the property, and there's also sometimes restrictions to what you can build. You can't suddenly just build a complete castle on it. So have a look into that. There should be documentation about that, but it's not as straightforward as buying a property.
Okay. All right. Then a question from Juan. He asks, if I understand well, you transfer 10% guarantee to the notary, and you get it back after the mortgage has been approved. Is that correct?
Yeah, correct. Well, in a practical sense, you'll pay the closing fees from the 10%. So let's say the closing fees were 20K, then the notary transfers back 30K.
Yeah, okay. All right. For you, Kimo, how important is build year and energy label in the buying decision?
In the buying decision, that's personal, right? Because if we look at properties that have a bad energy label, then the majority of those properties is built a while ago, because most properties that were built in the last 5 to 10, 15 years have decent energy labels. But there might be a reason why you would want to buy a property that's a little bit older, because it has character, because it feels very specific or typical. I think so in the buying decision, it's more subjective. From a value perspective, I know that, so if I look at some of the major cities that for example, have little canals in them. So whether it's Utrecht, Amsterdam, Gouda, Leiden, name it. What we see is that properties that are built in this kind of like characteristic manner have a different value than if you would buy on the same location a completely new build. I do believe that if you buy a new build, then you won't have that much issues with maintenance in the foreseeable future. Whereas if you buy a property that is a little bit older, you might have to fix some things, and especially in the properties that have been built around the 1900s. Please be mindful that you're saving enough money to actually maintain the property. But we do see a difference in perception of value, whereas properties with more character are valued a little bit higher versus properties that are newer builds. And it also depends on when it was actually built. There's a certain time in the Netherlands where they didn't really care, or maybe it was beautiful back then. I can't believe it. I think that was more pragmatic than anything else. If the building on the outside doesn't have charm, then most likely you'll pay less for it, or you'll get less for it when you sell it again, versus a property that has a little bit more charm. And there's just certain times in Dutch history where the architects were not paid for their creativity, they were paid for their efficiency. How could we build fast and low cost using certain materials? Yeah, if your property doesn't have an arc or any organic or shapes, then most likely it's from that time. But have a look into that. In the end, it's your subjective opinion, what you would like to buy, but be mindful of these things.
Okay. Then again for you, Cesar, does residence permit type, so if you're a non-EU, affect chances for obtaining mortgage?
Yes, it does. So if you're an EU citizen, then every bank will accept you. There are some banks that have extra conditions. So, for example, you already need to be in the Netherlands for at least 3 years, 2 years, those types of conditions. If you're a non-EU citizen, if you have the 30% ruling, it becomes easier. Or if you came here as a highly skilled migrant, then it becomes easier. But being a non-EU citizen is a bit more difficult. Yeah. Not impossible, but it is slightly more difficult. Yeah.
Okay. Then another question for you, Cesar. According to the timeline in the presentation, you first make the offer and then you ask for a mortgage. How can you bid for a house if you do not know how much mortgage you can get?
You cannot get a pre-approval from a bank. We don't have such a system. What we can do is, and it makes more sense, first step is knowing how much home you can afford. In other words, if you take out a maximum of 2 to 2.5 hours and spend that time with us, we won't bite. We'll make a couple of stupid jokes, but then you'll know exactly how much you can borrow, what to expect, how much you need to pay. You'll know all details, and you'll be fully prepared to take the next step. And it's only 2.5 hours that you're spending with us.
You walk out with a smile.
Exactly. That's not a punishment. Cool. All right. Next question is from Oksana. What is a better strategy, to borrow as much money as your bank can allow, or as little as possible?
So from a financial perspective, borrowing is cheap. You can put your money to work. In other words, invest it in something, in an asset. So it makes more sense to borrow as much as possible. The other way around, again, you have the emotional side. Some people don't like having debt. Then it's better to have obviously a lower debt and borrow as less as possible. Borrowing less than the value of the property has a perk, and that's that the bank will give you a discount because their risk is lower.
Okay. A little earlier, we talked about the taxes that you have after you secured your home. This question is, what are the taxes that was mentioned in the buying versus renting? Is the property tax, for example, which needs to be paid every year? Or is that something that you only pay once?
No, so it's exactly what the combination of Kimo's answer and my answer. So you have the municipality taxes such as sewage, etc. You have the property tax and you have the homeowners tax.
Okay. Let's see. Another question from anonymous attendee. How expensive is it to sell a house if I want to move out after some time?
So selling a house also requires work from some parties. Like you can decide if you want to do it yourself, maybe use an online platform to post your property on Funda and so on. And if you ask agent, then they'll charge a percentage somewhere between 1 or 2%, depending on what kind of agent you request. You also have costs for actually valuing the property, and you have costs for the notary, of course. Then I'm not sure, are there any costs involved from a mortgage broker perspective?
No, you can sell your home, but the bank will not charge a penalty or anything or additional fees. You simply need to repay your debt. In some countries, you also need to pay interest that the bank is missing, but we don't have it over here. Dutch banks would like to welcome you again as their new mortgage client. So they will not, they want their money back. You pay that by selling the property, and then they hope to see you again in a couple of months. So that's, yeah, no extra charges. Only the notary charges a small fee to take out the mortgage deed out of the public land register. That's it.
What I maybe would recommend, if you decide to sell your house and you have some value that you can get it out of it, have a chat with a financial advisor. Well, luckily, Cesar's in the room. These guys also can actually inform you about what to do with your capital. If you decide to stay in the Netherlands, there are certain things that might be good to know for you with the extra value that you get out of your property. Or if you decide to invest in something else, have somebody actually chat with you about this, because you don't want to have the money stay in your account for too long, because of course, depending on the amount, there might be some wealth taxes that you'd have to pay over. So that's what I would advise.
Thanks.
All right. For you, Cesar, how does it work with tax deductions if you're not married? Does that affect it at all?
No. So when you buy a home, so you're not married. When you buy a home, you become fiscal partners,
Mm-hmm.
and then you can decide to deduct the interest 50-50, 40-60, 100%, 0%. But this is a tax related question. So a tax advisor could calculate for you which is the best.
Okay, so in this case, it would also be possible to, for example, buy something like 70-30%.
So you have the legal part of owning a property. Common is between 60 and 40, and 50-50 is absolutely the standard. Yeah. And if anybody wants anything else, then usually it's within that range, because then you could still call it your own home. You can still deduct fees, interest. So that's the range of 60-40. 70-30. Why would you want to do that is then the question. What are you trying to achieve? And usually there are other ways to achieve what you want to achieve that are less difficult.
All right, cool. Well, we just answered 2 questions in one, so that's perfect. A question from Mark. Mark asks, I see the appraiser and the building inspector are arranged after our offer is accepted. How can we know the market value or the defects of the property? can we still then pull out or negotiate at that stage? In the same line, you said base offer on market value, not on the price advertised. But how do we know the market value if we only involve you after the offer is applied or accepted?
That is a good question. And there's technically two questions in there. One is about the timeline, because what happens is if you get your offer accepted, and between that moment and you sign the purchase contract, you can do your due diligence. And what's good to know is that you're not committed to a deal until after 3 days after the purchase contract is signed and the cool-off period expires. Anytime before that, you can pull out the deal without giving any reason. So let's say you get the appraiser and technical inspector in, and they don't come back with a very good report, then you can either negotiate or you can pull out, right? Even if they come back with a good report and like after you've signed the purchase contract, you wake up middle of the night like, oh my God, what did I do? You can still pull out. Once the cool-off period expires, then it becomes a little bit more difficult. How do you learn about the value of the property? Well, we can help you with that. There's something called the land registry. You can also dig in there because they have a lot of the property values. It's not as easy as it seems. It requires some level of expertise, but it is publicly available information. But we can also look into it, and we'll be able to share a little bit more information regarding that. You don't get us on board once your offer is accepted. Like when we help you before that. So when you're considering of buying a home, you can have us join you. Or when you're considering submitting an offer on a home, you can have us join you. In the latter case, we'll do the research before you actually submit the offer, so you'll have a valuation range, so you'll know what the value is of the property, what the evaluator will most likely give it. So that's how you can benefit from our expertise. And again, if it turns out that we were completely wrong, or you're not happy with any of the reports, then you can still pull out because we have the due diligence done before you sign the purchase contract, or at least you'll receive the contract before the cool-off period ends. So you can base any decision on the results of that report. I hope that answers your question a little bit.
Cool. All right, then we have a next question from Zoe. I think the question is for both of you. She asks, if I take a mortgage advisor, will they also help with advising on how much to bid or anything else apart from advising or arranging the mortgage? If not, is there someone else who would have the know-how on that?
I try to stay away from helping. I stay away from helping clients put in an offer because that's not my job. It's not my expertise. Please go to Chemo because he'll know what to do. He can do his research, and you'll have knowledge about what to do.
Yeah. Okay.
I think that answers. We're happy to help you on that side. We don't have any expertise when it comes to finances or mortgage, so right back at you. When it comes to what you can comfortably borrow or how you would need to set up your financing, have a chat with an expert, Cesar, Robin, or any of his colleagues. When it comes to figuring out what to offer and what a competing offer is, then we're happy to help you out with that.
Perfect.
I'll give a small example. Once I had two clients buying two apartments, exactly the same, same finish, same square meters, but they were one street behind each other. And there was a price difference of, this is a couple of years ago, but there was a price difference of 50K. And the valuation report showed that the difference was 50K. I don't know. So it's just to clarify why you need to make use of a buying agent. It's exactly this.
Cool. Thank you for that. So the next question is again from an anonymous attendee. What is and it's for you, Cesar, what is the approximate difference between the interest rate for a residential mortgage versus a buy-to-let mortgage?
1 to 1.5. So residential mortgage 1.6, then you're going to pay for the buy-to-let mortgage somewhere between 2.6 and 3.1.
Okay. All right. And next question is from Caro. Caro has a student loan. Does that affect the impact on the ability of getting a mortgage or its amount?
Not on the approval of a mortgage, but it does have an impact on how much you can borrow. I'll explain a bit how that calculation works. Based on your income, gross income, we look at how much you can spend on an on a monthly base. My apologies. Mm-hmm. The initial calculation is on an annual base, but then we recalculate to a monthly. Was that a cat?
Yeah, I saw a tiger. I love it.
It's my 15-week-old kitten. He just woke up, so I'm gonna put him in the other room. Say hello to everyone. Give me a few seconds.
Yeah. But so a monthly base, how much you can spend. Just an example. Let's say you can spend 1,000 euros per month on housing, but you are paying 200 euros per month on your student loan. Then what is left for your mortgage is 800 euros per month. So we use that 800 euros and calculate what the maximum mortgage is based on that 800 euros per month.
All right, cool. Let's see. The next question is from Masil. If I bid, for example, 250K and the appraisal says the value of the house is 210K, does that mean that I'm obliged to pay those 40K with savings, or can I back out after the appraisal?
So if you've done the appraisal before you sign the purchase contract, or you've received the report before the cool-off period ends, then you can technically pull out without giving any reason. So you can use, or you can tell them, hey, sorry, but I'm not going to be able to financially cover this, or I just don't feel like moving forward. Of course, don't take it too lightly, but that's what your right is. If that cool-off period expires and it turns out that the value that the appraiser gives to the property is lower than what you've offered, then it depends. If you haven't put a finance or mortgage clause in the offer and it's not in the contract, then you don't have any right to pull out. So you'd have to move forward. If you can't, then the seller can technically hold you liable for up to 10%. If you do have the cash, then you can still move forward. So it's a decision. If you have the clause in, and you have a mortgage or finance clause which states that you need 100% of the purchase price as a mortgage, and if you don't get that, you are allowed to pull out, then you can actually pull out and use that. Please be mindful that in Amsterdam, you'll need 2 sets of proof from mortgage providers, and some other cities you might only need 1. So please be mindful of that. Don't wait until the last day of that expiration date to inform the selling party. So please make sure that you get everything done in time. But those are technically the 3 options.
Okay. All right. Then the next question is again for you, Cesar. If it's from Shihao, if I don't have good enough income, but I do have enough savings, could I still buy the house, or could I still get the mortgage?
Yeah. You can always buy a home with cash, and getting a mortgage is based on your income. So if you can borrow 100K with a mortgage, then that's the amount you can get from a bank, and the rest needs to come from your savings.
Okay, so it's not possible to get a mortgage based on the amount of savings that you have?
No, because savings are not income.
Exactly. All right, cool. Let's see. And the same person asks, how many properties can one person own to rent to others? Or if there is a maximum, of course.
Yeah, no, there is no maximum. I wanted to name one number, but no, there's no maximum.
We have a Dutch royalty who owns a lot of properties.
He's well known for it, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Let's see. Do you still need a interpreter if your partner is Dutch?
Yep. So the importance is like, I think, no, hold on, it depends. If your partner only buys the property and he's the only name on the contract, then you wouldn't. But if you're both in the contract, then you both need to understand what you're signing up for. So you would need an interpreter.
Okay.
Be mindful, if your English is not very good, and you do speak another language, make sure that you inform the notary about this. So they'll be able to actually arrange the proper interpreter for you, because it's not going to work if you have an English interpreter and your English is not up to par. So and that happens. It's not an issue, but just be mindful of that.
It's good to know what you're signing, definitely.
Yeah.
Next question: does having already a property mortgage in your home country as a rental investment, for example, prevent you from getting a mortgage in the Netherlands? What if you can make a significant down payment?
Again, looking at your financial position, we look at how much you are spending, we look at how much you are earning, making sure that you're not getting too much credit on your name, because you need to be able to repay it. So if you have any other mortgages, then yes, that has an impact. However, if you're renting out, that could have a positive impact, because you're receiving income, rental income. Rental income can be used. So it depends on your entire financial position.
Okay. All right, cool. Question for you, Kimo, from Zach. Does the buyer have to have an agent?
Nope. It's not it's not, no, it's not necessary. Technically you don't need an agent. No, I think that's the short answer. It's not rocket science either, what we do. It is useful, especially if you don't speak the language or if you're not able to get to the data that's necessary. But you can definitely buy yourself. I must say, I bought myself before I went into this business. And I was fully confident, but the things that I know now, I think I was just lucky. That's it. Sometimes you are, sometimes you're not, and then you might end up with something that you'll regret. Again, it's up to you. I think that you'd have to weigh out the value versus the reward in that sense. If you and that's why, again, we don't believe in percentages, right? If you pay a lot of money for an agent, and the more you pay for a property, the more likely it is that there's less competition. So let's say if you have a budget of €1 million, it might be a little bit easier than if you have a budget of €400,000. So why would you pay more? And then suddenly the reward is not that big with using a buying agent. Whereas if you buy for a lot less, it's maybe more competitive, and it does help having and that's the upside and the downside of the industry. Like, there's a big network of real estate agents, and what they do is they tend to kind of like favor offers that are submitted with a real estate agent. Why? Because they know that the party is more sure and have done their due diligence, and they're less likely to kind of like pull out because maybe they're submitting multiple offers or they're not really sure. So they do that, and it's a bit of a network thing. We don't try to position ourselves like that. We're not the usual real estate agents, but we do benefit from that every now and then. So yeah, it's not necessary. You don't have to do it, but would I advise it? No, I'm not going to sell myself.
Also, my 2 cents on it. I noticed that it's easier for us as well if a client buys a property with an agent, because they're already aware of what's going on, what's going to happen. The agreements are all taken care of, and it makes working a lot easier. And you're buying a home, so it's going to be stressful. Banks are not working as fast as they maybe could, so things take long. You can avoid a lot of stress by using an agent.
Cool. All right. Then another question from anonymous attendee: and does having 30% ruling have any benefits for a new homeowner?
Not anymore. So the 30% ruling has an advantage if you are a non-EU non-EU citizen, because some banks approve the mortgage faster, or that becomes a bit easier. But when it comes to maybe borrowing extra, since the duration is shortened to 5 years from 8, you cannot borrow a lot extra anymore. So no.
Okay.
So approving is a bit faster. That's the only thing.
All right. Then another question: is it possible to buy a house with a temporal residence permit?
Yeah, is this from a mortgage perspective? Yes, you can. Buying it never is an issue if it's cash, right?
So it doesn't have an impact on whether you can buy a property or not. Like the mortgage is leading in this case. So the seller's not going to care if you can stay here for 1 or 2 years, or if you can stay here indefinitely. So we don't share that information with the seller either. So yeah, it's a little bit more linked to a mortgage. Yeah.
Okay, cool. And then again for you, Cesar, are there any fees, charges involved if we sell a house in a short period, like charges for pre-closure of mortgages?
No extra charges from the bank. They want to welcome you again. 9 out of 10 clients buy a new home when they sell their old home. So yeah, they hope you come back.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. And then if you are a couple, you're married, and you're going to buy a house together, but your significant other is not in the country, is that a problem at the notary? Do you both need to sign the contract, or is one signature enough?
So if you're both going to sign the transfer deed and the mortgage deed, then you would both need to sign it. You don't need to be present to sign it, but if you're not present, then you need to give power of attorney. And especially for the mortgage deed and the transfer deed, you need to actually go to the notary to give power of attorney. We've had one case where the client forgot to inform us that he was traveling back to the US. And we had to actually draft a power of attorney with a US notary, but the services that the notaries offer there are a little bit different. So there's all these rules and regulations you have to take into account. So make sure that you maybe spend a couple of days in the Netherlands to give power of attorney to a specific person, to either your better half or to the notary, so that that document or those documents can be signed. But legally, you don't have to be in the country to sign it. Of course, there will be a final inspection taking place before you sign the transfer deed and the mortgage deed, and it would be useful to have somebody representing you there in case it turns out there's a big hole in the wall that wasn't there when you last viewed it. So yeah.
Okay, cool.
Before you move on, Ludo, from a mortgage perspective, this has huge implications. So I already mentioned the bank's looking at your income. The bank looks at earnings, spending. If your wife is not living in the Netherlands, then she's living elsewhere. Then the bank is going to ask questions about housing costs. So why does this have huge implications? It's because, so I already mentioned, the bank is looking at income, how much you can spend on a monthly base. Let's say it's 1,000 euros. Your wife is already spending 800 on a home elsewhere. Then it means you have 200 euros left for a mortgage over here. So it has huge implications. So it's better to prepare these types of details so you will not have any surprises later on when you're signing paperwork.
Okay, cool. Then back to you, Kimo. Question from Dimitri. What happens if something breaks in the house that the technical advisor did not warn about? So for example, from 1 to 3 months from living there, something breaks, who is responsible for the potential reparations?
So the key here is if you can prove that the seller was aware of it during his stay in the property up until the day of transfer. If that's the case, then because the seller has the obligation to inform you about things that you should be aware of, and most of these things apply to things that are not necessarily visually seeable. That's maybe a develop, but so let me give you an example. If you go into the property and you see a crack in the wall, then you as a buyer have the obligation to ask questions about that. The seller doesn't necessarily have to inform you about, hey, there's a crack in the wall, because you can see it, right? If it's hidden though by a painting, or if it's on the floor, or if it's anything else, and the seller is aware of it, then he has the obligation to inform you about it. If something breaks after you've moved in that wasn't picked up by the technical inspector, then the first thing is to figure out, hey, did the seller know about this, and did he have to inform you about this, or was this something that you could have picked up on when you actually viewed the property and did the inspection? If it's something that the seller should have informed you about, then you can inform him and say, hey, sorry, but this is something you should have told us, and now you're technically liable. The longer you wait, the more difficult it becomes to prove that, though. Let me give you an example. Let's say the boiler dies after half a year that you've moved in. And the boiler was working perfectly fine when you moved in, no issues whatsoever, and then it just dies. Okay, there's a couple of cases. One is just bad luck, right? The other one, it might just be old age, so you know it was going to die at some point. If it's a new boiler and it breaks, then it's most likely bad luck. If you can figure out that the boiler broke because of poor maintenance or anything like that, then you might have a little bit of a case, but it's very, very difficult to prove that. Plus, the longer it takes, the more likely it is that something might break. So please be mindful of that in the first weeks that you're in the property, so you know that you can still have a chance of holding the seller liable.
Okay, cool. And then a relatable question, or something that is quite similar. What about asbestos? So is it possible to get an inspection for the asbestos?
So what might be good for you to know is that asbestos was used up until a certain time. I think it's the 90s, early 90s. It was used up until then, and after that, it became forbidden because it was damaging to people's health. Right? It's still in a lot of properties. Why? Because it was very fire preventive. The material. So you'll see it a lot in places that you don't want to have breakdown during fires, or that have strong heat passing through, whether it's chimneys or maybe stairs, because you don't have a stair dying on you when there's a fire. So you'll see them well, you won't see them because the majority of the times it's actually hidden, it's inside or behind the wall. And that makes it a little bit tricky. What you can do is get a technical inspector in to inspect a visual inspection, or to look into some of the construction papers, but it's very unlikely that they'll be able to uncover asbestos that they cannot see, because not often is it put in some of these drawings where they say, okay, we're going to use that as asbestos. Most of the time, they'll be able to tell you based on the time that it was built in, or some of the characteristics of the property will give away that asbestos might have been, or there's a strong chance that asbestos has been used. Please know, it's not damaging if it's not damaged, right? So if the asbestos is intact and it's behind the wall, then it's not damaging to your health or anything like that. And very often it's just kept there because you don't want to tear down the whole wall or tear down the whole building to locate all the asbestos. However, if you find asbestos, then you need to take into account that you need to remove it under certain or specific conditions.
Yeah.
And that might cost you a little bit of money, or a lot of money if it's a lot of asbestos. Yeah. Hope that answers your question a little bit.
Cool. All right. I think it does. For you, Cesar, question: how much can I borrow according to my income? Is there a way to count that or to calculate it?
Yeah, we have a calculator on our website, but it's not only income. Obviously, is a big variable in it, but it's not the only variable. But you can use online calculators. But the easiest way is, again, to spend 2.5 hours with us, and you'll be fully prepared. But You can use the online calculators to have an idea of what to expect. But usually there's more possible than the online calculators because those are teasers.
Yeah. Okay. Kimo, for you, what aspects of the offer does the seller use to decide whether they accept it or not, other than the value of the offer, of course?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So it depends a little bit on the situation. So let's say the seller has bought a new property and they can move into the new property in April, but they still need to do some renovations. So technically they want to stay in the current property until after the renovations have been finished. Then they might take an offer that has flexible time frame. So it has a flexible window on when the buyer wants to move in. Of course, purchase price is most often the most important thing. Let's say your offer is exactly the same as an offer of somebody else, and that somebody else turns out to be an investor. Then sometimes being a private owner and maybe sharing a little bit more about yourself, like a little personal story, can actually help out. But they'll look at the purchase price first, of course, and then I think the most important thing for the seller is having that security. Cesar addressed it a little bit earlier in the presentation as well, is they'll want to know if you're actually able to move forward and if you will move forward, right? Because you don't want to sell a house and then find out 4 weeks or 6 weeks later that the buyer is pulling out because he hasn't done his homework. So that's going to be important. So when you submit an offer, make sure that you inform the selling party that you've done your due diligence, you know where you can borrow, or you have some extra capital, and also display that in your offer, right? So you can say, I'm going to go for a mortgage clause, but I'm not going to go for the full 100% because I have some capital. It doesn't mean you have to put up the capital, but it just means that if the bank only gives you less or a little bit less, then you can still bridge that gap with some capital yourself. Timeline, same thing. Like if you have a confident mortgage broker, and this is maybe also one reason why we would advise you to go to a mortgage broker, is because they'll be able to secure and advise you on getting a mortgage a little bit faster than some of the banks do. So timeline is important. So if you can give the seller a faster guarantee about whether you're going to move forward or not, that's going to matter. What else? So you're competing against other offers. And of course, the most attractive offer is the offer with the highest price, with the least conditions, and with the most favorable conditions for the seller. So have a chat with your mortgage broker about that, but also with your agent. Okay, what conditions do we put in? Do we want the seller to fix all of the stuff that is damaged or broken or needs to repaint it? Then the more of those conditions you put in, the less attractive your offer becomes. It's a little bit psychology, right? Put yourselves in their shoes and say, okay, hey, either I want to move out slowly because I am waiting for my property. The other version is I'm maybe going through a divorce and I want to move out quick because I want to get rid of this thing and I want to earn as much money as possible because we have to split it. The other version is that, let's say you've moved into a property with your partner and you have the second property which now lies empty because the tenant has vacated the place. And then you also want to transfer quickly because you're losing money on a monthly basis. So try to find out a little bit more from the landlord what their situation is, why they're selling, how fast they want to transfer, and if there's any criteria that are important to them. Maybe the last thing is, let's say they have a lot of furniture that they want to sell to you or that they want to hand over, then you might want to take that into account with the offer. Yeah, so that's those are the key things that we always advise to take into account when you submit an offer.
Okay, cool. Then for you, Cesar, a question from Gustavo. If I'm a EU citizen, recently moved to the Netherlands, what is the minimum period before asking for a mortgage if I have a permanent contract? Is there a waiting time? Or?
Could you repeat
it?
The last
Yeah.
part of the sentence?
No worries. So Gustavo is a EU citizen. He recently moved to the Netherlands. What is the minimum period before asking for a mortgage if he has a permanent contract?
So this is a bit of yeah. So if you already have a permanent contract and you are moving to the Netherlands, so you're still, let's say, working in Madrid, but you're moving to the Netherlands, you already have a contract with your employer, then you could already buy a property and you could already get a mortgage. So there is no. So we work with 28 banks. There's a lot to choose from. Some banks will say you need to be in the Netherlands for at least 2 years, 3 years, etc. But there are also banks that accept a mortgage application from you from day one, or even without being actually here, or without even starting the job. So that's yeah.
Okay. All right. So let's say Gustavo is all settled in the Netherlands and is ready to buy the house. Can he take a personal loan to pay off some of the costs for the mortgage, transfer fees, etc.?
No. The rule says you can borrow 100% to purchase a property, and what product it is doesn't.
Okay. All right. And then again, regarding the mortgage, anonymous attendee asks, is it possible to include the renovation costs in the mortgage?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So the appraiser Michelle is going to the property. She comes back with a market value. You told Michelle, I want to put in a new kitchen, and I want to redo the bathroom. It's going to cost me 25K. This is a specification. Then Michelle will look at the current state of the kitchen, of the bathroom. Let's say it's a kitchen from the 70s. You cannot really use it anymore. Then the appraiser will say, okay, if you put in a new kitchen, that will add value to the property. And then what Michelle, the appraiser, will do is in the report, she will state a market value and a market value after renovation. And then you can borrow 100% of the value after renovation. What's good to know, not every euro you're going to put in by renovating can be financed. Usually you can, this is a rule of thumb, if you are going to renovate for 10K, the bank will give you 6K. So 60%.
Okay. Okay. Then a quite similar question. For example, if the value property from the appraisal is below my mortgage allowance, is it possible to increase the value of the property? Example given via renovation. Is it possible to increase the mortgage then as well?
Yeah, so the example I gave, the market value after renovation, you can borrow up to 100% of that. But what's good to know, the bank is going to keep, so let's say you're stating that you're going to renovate for 25K, then the bank will keep that amount in a deposit at the bank. So the bank is not transferring that to your account, or the bank keeps it in a deposit. And every time you have you receive an invoice from, for example, the kitchen supplier or bathroom supplier, you forward it to the bank checks it, and then they transfer the money to you or to the supplier.
Okay, cool. Then we have the last question from the Q&A. Can I repay? Oh, never mind. We just got another one. Can I repay the loan before the set term by paying more in every monthly installments? So I think this is for you, Cesar.
So additional repayments are possible. With most banks, it's up to 10% of the original principal. There are banks that offer 15. There are banks that offer 20% of the original principal. So you could be done somewhere between 5 to 10 years with the mortgage without paying additional fees.
Okay, cool. Then I think from the same person asked, could you say something about refinancing a mortgage after 1 year after purchasing?
Yeah. I don't. Usually that doesn't make a lot of sense because if you leave the current bank, you're going to pay a penalty. And then you look at how long will it take to hit the break-even point to earn back the money that you paid into the penalty. Hmm. Usually it doesn't make a lot of sense, especially after 1 year. Could be different if it's after 6, 7, 8 years, but 1 year is too soon.
Okay. And then the question, can you still get a mortgage if you have a criminal record to get stable finances? Does that affect the chances of getting a mortgage?
The
Yes.
same guy with the fine.
Probably, yeah. No, so the bank is also performing their due diligence. Do they want to accept you as a client? Yeah.
Yeah.
So it could have an impact.
Okay. And then now really the last question from the Q&A from Pedro. Are there any tax benefits in higher mortgage values? Yeah, are there any tax benefits?
Yeah, the tax benefit. Yeah, the tax benefit is the mortgage interest deduction, but the value doesn't matter.
No, so in that case, it doesn't matter if you get the higher mortgage or do a higher down payment, for example.
Yeah, okay. No, it doesn't. It depends on the interest that is paid.
Okay. All right, cool. Then we're going to move on to the chat. I'm going to scroll through the chat a bit to see if we have some questions that we have not answered yet. Let's see.
We're way over the time we had scheduled, by the way.
Yeah, maybe pick 5 questions, Ludo.
Yeah, I don't think there will be more than 5 questions that we haven't had yet. Let's see.
Yeah, I see there's some double ups, right? So questions that are asked in the chat and in the Q&A.
Yeah. Let's see.
Kimo.
Yeah.
Could you go back to the slide with the at the end?
Yeah.
Okay, so I have a question for you, Cesar. How easy or difficult is it to use savings from outside of the EU?
What's good to know? 9 out of 10 banks don't like it if the savings are not in a euro savings account.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, if you have a French bank account, it's fine. Dutch banks trust French banks, so they don't mind. But if it's in a non-euro currency and outside of the EU, then they won't accept it. Yeah.
Okay. All right. And again, for you, Cesar, is it possible to split the mortgage amount with the different mortgage providers? Would you advise this, or yeah?
In theory, yes, it's possible, but why would you do that? You'll have twice the mortgage fees. You'll have it. From a practical perspective, it doesn't make a lot of sense. From a theoretical perspective, yes, you can do it, but why would you?
Yeah. Okay. And then a question regarding the property tax. Is the property tax the same if the apartment is brand new? If it's just a newly built?
Yeah, we didn't include the VON and KK this time, Kimo. So
I'm happy to share some
Yeah.
information about that if you want. So if you buy a new build property, there's a few differences. One is that you won't be paying transfer tax. And the second is that sometimes the WOZ value is not very clear yet on that property. And property taxes are linked to the WOZ value. So sometimes it takes a little bit of time before you start paying that. But the main difference is that you'll not be paying any transfer tax on a new build because you're buying directly off the developer. Please be mindful is that sometimes there's some party in between. So the developer has sold it to an owner, then owner sells it to you, then suddenly you will be paying transfer tax. What the difference is that it's most of the time defined by either you buy it with kostenkoper, buying costs, or you buy it without those and it's free at name. So that's important for you to know. If you buy directly from the developer, you won't pay transfer tax, and the I think the transfer deed and the purchase contract are drafted by a notary and paid for by the seller or by the developer. So so there are some advantages there, but there's also some not necessarily downsides, but things you have to take into account. If you buy a new build, you initially buy the ground and then you pay in installments for every level that they finish the building. And that has an implication on your mortgage because you won't be able to move in to a building. So you'll have maybe your rental costs or your current home that you're paying a mortgage on, and then you'll have your second mortgage. And maybe says you can share or spot some light on that.
Yeah, so the upside is that with a newly built, you don't have a couple of fees that you need to pay, where in comparison to buying an existing home. However, I've seen a case where it took 2.5 years before the developer finished the apartment. So during those 2.5 years, people were paying the mortgage and their rental property. It's not a fun situation to be in. So, yeah.
All right, cool. Then we have the last question of the evening. Question from Lino. It's I think for you again, Cesar, but maybe you can share your insights as well, Kimo. Lino asks, could you refinance to get some of the equity out to use for other investments? And when would you recommend to do so? For example, if the value has gone up already by 20 or 25%.
Yes, you can. It depends a bit on your current bank. Because if you take out equity, the bank wants to know what you're going to do with that equity. And it could be that they won't let you borrow the equity that you want to take out against exactly the same terms and conditions as the rest of the mortgage. To give an example, some banks will not allow you to take out the equity and borrow it for 30 years again, but they will cap it, for example, to 15 years. So you need to repay it faster. But you can take it out and use it, for example, to invest in stocks, to invest in bonds, to invest in real estate. So yeah, you can, as long as your income is sufficient as well.
All right. Cool.
Yeah.
Maybe I have a question about that because we recently had a client who was actually interested in that, and he was thinking of taking, what is it, like refinancing it, but then investing it in a property that he would like to let out. Would it then become a buy-to-let mortgage?
Yeah, the second mortgage would be a buy-to-let, or I don't know if I understood the question.
So the value increased of the property, and he's paid something off, and then he would take out kind of like that difference to invest in a second property. Mm-hmm. But would that fall under a residential mortgage? That difference that you can take out. So the second property he would buy would be a residential under a residential mortgage, so it would have the favorable terms.
No, so the mortgage is increased with the residential property as a collateral.
Yeah.
So the client is taking out the equity, and once it's out, he can spend it as he pleases. Mm-hmm. So the bank doesn't have a say in that second property.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
This, yeah. we do this quite often.
Yeah.
All right, I think that's it for tonight.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, everyone. We had a good crowd. I think a little bit over 100 people. Thanks for the ones sticking around. As the slide shares, please feel free to reach out to us, schedule a free intake if you have any further questions. You might wake up tomorrow morning and be like, oh, I should have asked that. Then don't hesitate to reach out. We will be here for you. Use the tools on our platforms, whether it's the tax calculator, the mortgage calculator, or the purchase cost calculators. Have a look at them. Have a lovely evening. Stay safe, stay warm, and stay healthy. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks for attending.